This episode of Around the Oval is brought to you by Todd Pennington with Revolution Mortgage.
Hey, Ohio State fans, Alex Gleitman here, back with another edition of Around the Oval, brought to you by Todd Pennington with Revolution Mortgage. Ohio State is on a bye this week, and it certainly is a great opportunity for the Buckeyes to get some rest, get some guys healthy, and focus on what should be a tough stretch to finish the season in their pursuit of yet another Big Ten title and potentially another college football playoff berth. To talk about the crazy season that's been so far in college football and a little bit about what to expect from Ohio State in the back half of the year, among a few other topics, we bring in senior college football writer from ESPN, Adam Rittenberg. Adam, thanks for joining the show. Appreciate you making the time and coming on.
Thanks for having me, Alex. It's good to be back.
Absolutely. And, I think let's start off with just how crazy this college football season has been. I think every single week there's been a major upset. I mean, I wouldn't call Georgia over Clemson an upset in week one, but that certainly, I think, was a surprising game, just the way that played out. And Clemson getting their first loss, getting a second loss later on. Ohio State obviously losing in week two. Alabama going down this past week. A number of other upsets. Cincinnati, of course, over Notre Dame, and a few others in there. It's just been an absolutely crazy, wild college football season. Just wanted to get your general thoughts on the season to date through, I guess, the first 6 weeks or so. And if you thought there was any reason why things have been so wide open this year so far.
Yeah, it definitely has been definitely surprising. I would say that you wonder, there was so much talk about last year being unusual. You kind of wonder if whether that was almost a delayed effect, that the COVID year and the circumstances around rosters, some rosters have a lot of super seniors, so there's, kind of unprecedented veteran leadership with some teams, and then you also had a lot of really good quarterbacks who left for the NFL, and that always has the potential to affect teams. So, you're never in this sport. It's always surprising when the results are surprising, because we have had so much of the same for the last, 5, 6, 7 years. And this year absolutely is set up to be, a year more like 2007, or you can go back even further, where there's a lot of uncertainty. And other than Georgia, you don't know if there is a truly dominant team out there, and maybe Georgia won't be. We think that they look like it, but some results that are coming up could certainly change that. So yeah, definitely a lot of surprises out there, and I think it makes it for a more entertaining season from a national standpoint.
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot of chaos so far. I think there's going to be more to come. A lot of big time matchups set up in the back half of the season, so it's going to be exciting to watch. You're a Northwestern grad. Your roots are kind of covering the Big Ten. That's how you kind of got started at ESPN. But so I want to talk about the Big Ten. Pretty incredible. 5 top 10 teams. First time that's ever happened for them. Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and Michigan State are from the Big Ten East. I guess holistically, my first question is the Big Ten the best conference in football? And then secondly, is the Big Ten East the best division in college football, in your opinion, right now?
Yeah, to your second question, absolutely. Just because of those numbers that you mentioned, Ohio State and Penn State had done their part over the years. Michigan State is really the biggest surprise in the country, at least that I can see, bouncing back from being a really down team in 2010 that was going through some transition to a legitimate top 10 team right now. And then Michigan is emerging. Michigan has had different issues that have kind of held it back, but they've made some changes on their coaching staff that are working out. They're playing a lot better defensively. They're getting some more from their quarterback, even though I don't think they're elite at that position. And so it all sort of adds up to a pretty very strong division. Is the Big Ten the best conference? I think you could argue the same thing. Now, the West Division isn't as strong as it has been in years past, as a few programs are down on that side. But the strength of the East plus Iowa and what Iowa's been able to do, I don't know if the SEC even has that much, behind it. I think it'd be between those two leagues. Georgia, Kentucky's had a really good start of the season. They're playing one another. Obviously, in the West, you have Alabama, A&M, Arkansas, Ole Miss, but I think it's a fairly comparable conversation to have at this point in the season as to which is the best conference.
Yeah, definitely. It's going to be interesting to see how the rest of the year plays out, because Ohio State still plays Penn State. They still play Michigan. They still play Michigan State, and same thing for Michigan State and same thing for Michigan. So there's going to be a lot of, jockeying for position to win that Big Ten East. And then it's who's going to play Iowa on the other side and what happens in that game. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. Let's talk about the Buckeyes for a second. They obviously lost in week 2 to Oregon. Just didn't look right, even in their win against Minnesota opening week, obviously in the game against Oregon. And Ryan Day kind of made the hard decision to take the play calling away on the defensive side of the ball from Kerry Combs, hand it over to Matt Barnes. They made some schematical changes. They made some personnel changes. They figured out kind of more of an identity on offense, being able to lean on the run game and true freshman Travion Henderson a lot more, which I think has certainly helped open up their passing game and made them just more efficient and a more a well-oiled machine on the offensive side of the ball. But at the same time, the last 3 games where they've looked better, they played Akron, Rutgers, and Maryland, far inferior opponents, certainly when it comes to the talent on the roster. So I guess my question to you, through 6 weeks, halfway through the season, Ohio State is at 5-1, entering a bye week before a tough stretch where they play at Indiana, home against Penn State, at Nebraska, home against Purdue, home against Michigan State, and at Michigan. Right now, is Ohio State, I guess, in your mind, a legitimate national title contender, or is it still kind of wait and see with them?
Yeah, no, I think it's wait and see, but I think they're absolutely and always should have been a playoff contender, because they're a team that's dominated the Big Ten to the point where no one should be considered the favorite in this conference until you beat Ohio State. And obviously a second loss would knock them out. So until they lose again, they're the favorite, in my view, even though Iowa's ranked higher, and Michigan and Michigan State both have 0 losses. Penn State's had a good season as well. So I don't think they're a national title contender with this defense. I think there's some room to improve there, but I don't know if the problems on that side are going to be solved with a play caller change, to, a Matt Barnes, who's done a decent job so far. I don't know if you can fix all of this in one season midway through. We'll find out. I mean, if anyone could do it, it's Ohio State, because of the talent that they have and also the strength they have on the offensive side. But my sense is that there'll have to be some bigger picture decisions on that side after the season that would then get them in better position to make a run next year. But they're still in it, and they can't lose again, and they're playing really well on offense, and CJ Stroud looks great, and Travion Henderson looks great, and those receivers, and they are playing a little bit more together, it seems like, on defense. But I'm just hesitant, because I don't know if just changing play callers and playing a few inferior opponents, gets everybody feeling like this defense, everything's fine again. I still need to see how they do, especially against a team like Michigan State. I was just looking up these numbers, Alex. In Michigan State, between 2016, which was the year after they made the playoff, and last year, they were among the bottom 10 in the country in yards per play. Now they're, I think, 4th. And so that just shows how much of a difference they've made in the offseason with improvement, with new players, and just a great job by their players and coaches. So that's going to be a nice test for Ohio State, as will Penn State, hopefully, if Sean Clifford is healthy, and then an improved Michigan offense. So still some hurdles to get through, but I think no one would be surprised if we're sitting there in Indianapolis and Ohio State is celebrating another Big Ten championship.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I agree with a lot of what you said on the defense. I'm still in wait and see mode. I do think, though, that, to your point, the offense, as long as, and the other thing we didn't talk about is CJ Stroud getting that week of rest or 2 weeks of rest or whatever it was, basically not throwing the football. It seems to definitely, he looks just a little bit different out there, a little bit more confidence, throwing with a little bit more zip and accuracy the last couple of weeks. And I think if the offense continues to click and the run game's going with Travion Henderson and Stroud's throwing it like he is to those, just basically getting the balls to the playmakers, the Ohio State offense is going to be really hard to stop. And then I think the defense's job isn't to be elite like Georgia. It's just to be good enough so that the offense can get the ball back enough to score more than the other team. And we saw, Alabama's offense last year, LSU the year before, where, it looks like offenses are taking over college football, and your defense just has to be good enough. It doesn't have to be elite. I think Nick Saban made that switch. And I think, it's going to be really hard to get Ohio State's defense to where it was in 2019 with a middle of the season switch of coordinator and some personnel and some scheme. But my kind of big question, which we'll have to wait and see, is can they be good enough to get them another Big Ten title, get in the playoff, and then who knows, you go from there. So that will be interesting to watch. Let's talk about a few of those other Big Ten teams you mentioned. Michigan, I think a lot of Ohio State fans have seen this story before where they dominate September, maybe a little bit into early October. I don't think they have the Heisman candidates like Denard Robinson or Tate Forcier in the past where they were September Heisman candidates and then kind of faded down the stretch. But is this Michigan team for real? As you mentioned, I mean, Cade McNamara really hasn't proven that he can throw it at an elite level. Or is this going to be another example of a Michigan team that starts really hot and then when they play the tougher opponents in late October, early November, they end up, they're 6-0 right now. Do they end up something like 9-3?
It's certainly possible. And I think it would be really disappointing if that's the case, because most likely those 3 losses would be against, their 2 main rivals, and you throw in Penn State as a third rival, Michigan State, Ohio State, Penn State. So if that's the case, and Ohio and Michigan is still losing those games, that would be, pretty tough to kind of come to terms with if you're a Michigan fan. But I do think this team has made some strides that can't be taken away in the sense of, they had really been dominated by Wisconsin each of the last 2 years, and they hadn't won a game in Madison since 2001. And while Wisconsin's down this year and dealing with a lot of things on the offensive side, that win should always resonate. Any win up in Madison, especially when you've struggled as much as Michigan has in that stadium, that carries some weight. I think beating Nebraska, which was really confident team on the road, the way that Michigan did, without a perfect game in any facet, but finding a way there at the end, that also matters. But ultimately, it kind of brings into greater question, like what are the goals of Michigan? Is it to go 9-3? Is it to beat a Wisconsin or a Nebraska? No, it's to beat Ohio State. It's to beat Penn State. It's to win the Big Ten, which they haven't done for a very long time. So it's ultimately going to come down to, I think they should handle Northwestern in a week, but then Michigan State and Penn State in 3-week stretch on the road, 2 games on the road with Indiana sandwiched in between, and then obviously Ohio State at home to finish the season. So, you go 2-1, I think you feel great. You go 1-2, I think you feel okay. You go 0-3, and it's sort of back to questioning where the program is going. And obviously, if they went 3-0, this would be new air for Michigan because they haven't really been, other than the 2016 season, they haven't really been in the playoff conversation. So I think the record in those 3 games is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be something fun to watch. Obviously, Ohio State fans hope that no matter what, at least they have 1 loss and it's the last game of the year. But let's talk about the 2 other teams that, I think Penn State, while they're in it, the 1 loss certainly doesn't help them. They definitely need Sean Clifford back because Roberson just doesn't look like he's a guy who can bring them where they need to go this year. But let's talk about Iowa and Michigan State just real quick. Talking about Michigan State first. I mean, for me, what they've done through the portal, getting a couple guys back with that extra year, just Mel Tucker changing the culture of that program has been really impressive. And they are 6-0 to this point, but I look at their schedule and to me, I don't really see who they beat. That's all that great. Now, as you said, based on what they did last year, you wouldn't have expected them to be 6-0. So no matter how they finish the year, it's going to be really impressive. But I'm just having a tough time right now saying for sure that they are a legitimate top 10 playoff contending type team. What's your take on the Spartans right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of teams might not have the resume to be, in the top 10 or top 5 or whatever it is. But one thing that stands out about Michigan State is that they haven't really faced any big late game challenges other than the Nebraska game, which they were fortunate to win. And so you could certainly hold that against them. That punt return goes differently. They may go out and lose that game, but they found a way. And then otherwise they've been dominant. I mean, they beat Rutgers by 18. They beat Miami by 21. So obviously beat Northwestern handily in the first game. So it's another thing we'll find out more about. They have Indiana on the road this week, and then a bye, and then Michigan coming in. So a lot, it's similar to Michigan. We'll learn more about Michigan State down the stretch because they have that same combination of teams. Michigan at home, they have Ohio State on the road, Penn State at home to finish the year. So that's the ultimate proving ground. And but I can't say enough about Mel Tucker and what his staff have done in terms of flipping the roster and getting dramatically different results. A lot of teams in this portal era will try to do this, where they'll add a lot of transfers in one off season. And oftentimes it doesn't work. The mix of players doesn't work. Maybe there's been some misevaluations. It can lead to problems in the locker room when you bring in that many new players from the outside. And Michigan State hasn't had that so far. The guys they've brought in have helped them. And Mel Tucker, I was talking with Mel a few weeks ago. He said, we were very black and white with our current players. We said, listen, we got to get better players. So we're going to bring them in, and hopefully you guys will embrace them and we can do this together and get better, or basically, you can leave. And I think in some ways players appreciate that directness. It sounds a little ruthless, but I also think it's better to do that than to pretend like you're not doing that and then you actually are doing that. So I think that you credit the players who remained. I mean, Peyton Thorne's a great example. They brought in a quarterback via transfer, Anthony Russo from Temple, who'd been a multi-year starter, basically to be the quarterback, and Peyton Thorne didn't let him be the quarterback. So that's the response you want as a coach. If you bring in all these transfers, you want your current players to elevate their game and make sure that they're on the field. And there's been a mix of guys like Kenneth Walker, who obviously has made a huge impact at running back, leading the nation in rushing, but then other guys who have kept their jobs, who were on the team last year, which wasn't very good. So it's sort of been that perfect combination. But to your point, we're not sure how good they are.
Yeah, for sure. That's a team that I'm really interested to see. I think a lot of people listening to this are going to be hoping that they beat Michigan in just a couple of weeks. But let's talk about Iowa. They're a really interesting team to me. Great defense. I think there's no doubt about that. But I believe if I looked at my numbers correctly, they're last in the Big Ten in offense. They obviously have relied on a lot of turnovers and short fields and things like that. So that skews the numbers a bit. But looking at their schedule, I mean, there's really they should go to that Big Ten championship game undefeated. You never know what's going to happen week to week in college football, as we've seen. But with Iowa's offense being, to me, a big question mark, how do you view the Hawkeyes, when it comes to being able to overcome whoever wins the Big Ten East and then also potentially being in the college football playoff?
Well, I think with Iowa, which I like, I spent some time with their coaches last week. They don't take anything for granted. So you're right. On paper, they should get to the Big Ten championship game undefeated, but they know that they're not good enough to just walk out there and beat anyone. They have to play well. They have to execute at least decently in all three phases. And I like, they're very complementary football oriented. It's why, their punter might be the most popular player on the team because he's really good. Just as some of those defensive players are, and they can do enough on offense. It's interesting to me, Alex, how Iowa is viewed versus, like Oklahoma in recent years, where it was reversed. Great offense, terrible defense. And there's just this feeling that they're more like those Oklahoma teams are suddenly more legitimate than Iowa when they're basically doing the same thing in reverse. I think people need to, what you said earlier is right. That the national championship model in this day and age typically is elite level offense and good enough defense. But you look at the teams that are number one and number two right now in Georgia and Iowa, those are two of the best defenses in the country. And you certainly wouldn't say Iowa is one of the best offenses. And I think Georgia is a very good offense, but I don't think that they're a elite level offense with Stetson Bennett at quarterback quite yet. So I think the model for this year in winning might be different. It might not be, you need to score 50 points and do what Alabama did or LSU did, or really Ohio State did in 2019. You might need a little bit more balance. And so I think it's going to be a really interesting story to follow at Iowa. If they can continue to turn the ball over or generate turnovers like they have, can they make enough improvement on offense? Can they make enough big plays? How's their quarterback? All of that goes into the equation. And does it end up with them getting into the college football playoff or winning the Big Ten? Or is it ending up with them losing by 3 touchdowns to Ohio State in Indianapolis, or losing by 2 scores in a rematch of Penn State? That's what's so interesting about this team, because they certainly know that they're not 30 points better than anyone, but right now they're playing well enough to win.
Yeah. It's really gonna the whole Big Ten, how that plays out is just gonna be interesting and have a major impact on the college football playoff. So, right now it's easy to say Iowa's offense isn't that great, but things can change, and I'm curious to see how they do against whoever wins the Big Ten East. The last question I had before we jumped into a couple fan questions was predictions for the 4 teams that will make the college football playoff. I actually want to table that to the end. I want to ask a couple of these questions because it could kind of give away your predictions. So the first question from a fan on BuckeyeScoop.com was, does an undefeated Cincinnati get in the playoff?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, neither of us know that at this point. I think the better question might be, how do they get into the playoffs? And I think the key for Cincinnati is to limit the number of entrants from any of the Power Five leagues to one. Any league that has two, you just do the math. It takes up 50% of the playoff. And we have two leagues right now in the Big Ten and SEC that are in position to potentially have multiple entrants. Now, there was some good news for Cincinnati over the weekend on multiple fronts. The biggest one being Alabama losing a game. So Alabama now has one loss. Georgia obviously has zero. And if those two teams meet in the SEC championship game without losing any games, Cincinnati is going to want Georgia to beat Alabama, which would essentially take the Tide out of the playoff conversation. If Alabama beats Georgia, in that case, you'd imagine both teams are in. Same thing with the Big Ten. Iowa, like you said, could get to the Big Ten championship game undefeated. If that's the case and they lose a close game, are they out of the playoff? Is Cincinnati getting in ahead of them? That could certainly be a debate, but Iowa would have a more impressive resume, most likely, even with one loss, than Cincinnati would. The problem for Cincinnati is that they're, one of their better outer conference wins. Indiana is not going to help them. And the AAC is not very good this year. So what else is going to help their resume other than the win against Notre Dame? Now, Notre Dame could keep winning and get in the top 10, and that's going to look really good for Cincinnati at the end of the season. But they're going to need SMU to continue to win. Those two teams meet in Cincinnati in late November. They need Houston to keep winning. Houston hasn't lost a game since the opening weekend, and maybe meet them in the conference championship. So there's a lot of things that have to work out. Obviously, Oklahoma and Oklahoma State have to lose a game. Ideally, Oregon has to lose another game. So there's all these possibilities that you can go and compare them to Cincinnati. But unfortunately, the thing working against Cincinnati is just the strength of resume. The profile is not going to jump out there as much as some of these other contenders.
Yeah, Cincinnati, it's going to be interesting because how many years can they kind of do the same thing and show that they're for real and beat Georgia in a bowl game last year and all those things and not get in. But I do agree it's going to kind of depend on how the dominoes fall. Cincinnati's going to the Big 12. They've expanded after Texas and Oklahoma joined the SEC, who's expanded. The Big 10 announced the alliance with the ACC and Pac-12, but I think we all kind of laughed at that a little bit just because it's really just a commitment to schedule games against each other and things like that. But have you heard anything about Big 10 expansion, timelines, who they might target, anything along those lines?
No, it doesn't mean that no conversations aren't being had, but I think the alliance was formed largely as an alternative to expansion and to settle things down, throughout the landscape. I also just don't think there's very many realistic additions that help the Big Ten. A lot of people think the Big Ten shouldn't even be involved in the alliance because its revenue and the revenues of the Pac-12 and the ACC are not really comparable. I do understand why the Big Ten got involved, but I also just don't sense there's a huge appetite for expanding, other than if Notre Dame were interested or a team like that. Otherwise, you're going outside your region, most likely. How is it going to work? Is it an addition for just football? Is it an addition for all sports? How does that work with some of the Olympic sports? So I just don't think it makes a whole lot of sense for the Big Ten to go out and add what's left of the Big 12, or maybe some of the Pac-12 teams you could make a case for, but there just aren't a lot of like home runs out there. A lot of them are in the SEC already, and Notre Dame really doesn't have much incentive to leave its independent status. Big Ten's tried that before; it hasn't worked. I don't know why it would work now.
Yeah, I think everyone thinks Notre Dame obviously makes sense from a regional and historical standpoint. I think if you take away the whole regional thing, because it seems like no one's really abiding to their regions at this point. I mean, Big 12 expanded now to Nebraska, and they've expanded to Rutgers and Maryland, right? And so I think people are talking about maybe a USC makes a lot of sense, the LA market, and or a UCLA or Oregon and things like that. So I don't know. I'm going to be interested to see. I think eventually we're headed to more super conferences or larger conferences, I guess, if you will. I just don't know what that's going to look like eventually. But do they look at the ACC? Is North Carolina a team that makes sense? I just don't know. I know Atlanta with the Georgia Tech with the Atlanta market, I think makes sense from a business perspective, but is that a program that they want to pursue educationally? I would assume so. I just think that there's a lot of question marks. There are possibilities. I just don't know how realistic Kevin Warren and all the presidents are thinking about those possibilities. So we'll see how that one plays out. The next question I'll ask, and we'll wrap up in just a few, is looking at the Ohio State Penn State game on 10:30, I think some fans on the board were hoping you had any insight into how the process for selection of network between your company, ESPN, ABC, Disney, and then Fox, who gets the game, and then like what time that game might be. Because obviously Iowa, Wisconsin's already slotted for noon. Michigan State is still up in the air as well. And that's certainly a possibility for a night game too. So I think people are trying to see if you had any insight there.
Yeah, those decisions are made by a programming department. I really don't have anything to do with them. I did know a few weeks in advance that we wouldn't have the Penn State Iowa game, which is a bit of a bummer. But a lot of these these picks are made sometimes before the season, and sometimes are made closer to the actual games. And so and obviously we don't have as many Big Ten games as we once did, but we do have quite a few that are in that ABC Saturday night window. Most recently, obviously Michigan and Nebraska. So I think there's still a good chance that you look at Ohio State and Penn State; those are tremendous brands, and it would bring in a huge audience potentially if both teams still have only one loss. But again, I really don't have much to do with it. I wish I had more information for your audience.
Cool. And then we're going to put you on the spot on this one. I don't know if you have a good answer, but if you could pick any player in America, put them on a current top 10 team to improve that team, who would you pick and what team would you put them on?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about Iowa before, and I think again, if they had a little bit more explosiveness offensively, they'd be looked at in a very different light. So to me, it would be them, and it would be a guy like Matt Corral from Ole Miss. I mean, I think he is just playing at another level at quarterback right now. Even in the Alabama loss, he wasn't terrible. That Ole Miss was terrible overall, but I'd love to see Iowa having, even though I think Spencer Petras has done some good things, to have that type of a quarterback, an NFL guy, a guy that can make big plays. It really scares defenses. Now, it would be funny to watch Matt Corral in the Iowa offense with the Iowa coaches, but I as far as a guy who could certainly help Iowa, I think he's certainly one of them.
Awesome. And then the last question, and we'll leave you with this, is, as I said, not right now, who's your top four for the college football playoff, but your predictions on which four teams will end up making the college football playoff.
Yeah, so I think while I have my doubts in some ways about Alabama, I think they're going to find a way to get in. They usually do. So I'll go Georgia, Alabama. I'll go Ohio State. And then it's just tough, right? I think Iowa will lose a game, honestly, before the Big Ten championship. So I'm not projecting them in at this point. And I do think Oregon's going to lose again. So does it come out of the Big 12? I'll just throw in Cincinnati. Let's go with Cincinnati down the line. We do these picks every week, sort of in the moment, but down the line is a little bit trickier. So let's go with Cincinnati and say a group of 5 team gets in for the first time.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on this. I think Georgia's going to run the table, and then Alabama.
Well, if Georgia runs the table, they're out. Remember, if Georgia runs the table, Alabama's out.
Sorry, run the table until the SEC championship game, and then I just until they can Kirby Smart or anyone can prove that they could beat Alabama in that game. I think I got to go Alabama, which might set up a rematch in the second round or in the playoffs. But I think they try to avoid that, so it might vault Alabama to the top spot. I'd have them playing Cincinnati, and then you could get a really good Ohio State Georgia game. I'm the same way with Ohio State in the Big Ten. I think until someone knocks them off the throne, I think I got to put them in there. I think they're playing better football, but I think they certainly could lose and not even get in that game. So it will be interesting to see. But Adam, you've been gracious enough with your time. We're going to let you go. For everyone listening, you could give him a follow on Twitter at ESPN Rittenberg. Adam, thanks again for joining us. Always appreciate you giving us the time and joining us.
You bet. Thanks for having me on.
This episode of Around the Oval was brought to you by Todd Pennington with Revolution Mortgage. If you've been thinking about refinancing or buying a house, check out our sponsor, Todd Pennington with Revolution Mortgage. They offer low rates for refinancing and home purchase loans, including first-time home buyer programs, down payment assistance, and cash-out home equity loans. Check out revolutionmortgage.com/tpennington.